Manizales has the lowest sky in Colombia. The clouds arrive before dusk, entwining with the hills and enveloping the city in a thick humidity that smells of wet earth and freshly roasted coffee. It is a city of steep streets, wattle and daub facades painted in colors that time has faded, and families who have lived in the same neighborhoods for decades, with the quiet conviction of those who know that this land belongs to them. Hernando Restrepo Cardona lived in this landscape of mountains and routine. He was 66 years old and had the posture of someone who never learned to stoop. For 31 years, he had served as a notary at the second notary office of the Manizales Circle, a position that in Colombia's towns and medium-sized cities amounts to a kind of unspoken moral authority. Hernando signed deeds, validated inheritances, and provided public certification of the most important events in people's lives. Over time, this role had turned him into someone people turned to for advice, even on matters that had nothing to do with notarial law. He had been a widower for 19 years. His wife, Lucinda, died of a brain hemorrhage in the early hours of a Sunday morning, with no warning signs and no time for goodbyes. Hernando was 47 at the time and had a 5-year-old daughter named Daniela. He never sought to rebuild his personal life, or at least that was what he said when the subject came up. He said it with a calmness that ended the conversation before anyone could continue. Neighbors in the Los Cedros neighborhood remembered him as a proper man, punctual for Sunday Mass, attentive to the elderly on the block, generous with favors that didn't cost him much. He was the kind of person who commands respect without asking for it and who, precisely for that reason, is rarely questioned. Daniela Restrepo was 24 years old when this story began to become impossible to ignore. She was in her final semester of law school at the University of Caldas, and her professors described her as a rigorous, analytical student, capable of presenting arguments with a depth of reasoning surprising for her age. Her classmates, however, would remember her for another reason. Because she almost never spoke of her home, because she was always in a hurry to leave class, and because her phone rang with a regularity that seemed like a metronome. It was Hernando. He called every 2 hours when she wasn't within his direct sight. He didn't ask, he checked. The difference was subtle but constant. Hernando picked her up in his car every afternoon in front of the university's main building. A grey Renault Logan that knew every parking spot downtown. He arrived on time, sometimes before she even came down, and waited with the engine off and his eyes fixed on the entrance. If Daniela was more than 10 minutes late, the phone would ring. They lived alone in the family home in Los Cedros, a 2-story house with an interior garden where Lucinda had planted begonias that Hernando continued to water with a devotion the neighbors found touching. The house was tidy, well-maintained, with furniture that had been in the same place for decades. There was something about that order that wasn't simply cleanliness. It was the rigidity of a man who wouldn't tolerate things being moved from where he had placed them. The evenings in that house followed a routine Daniela knew by heart. Hernando read in the living room until 10. She could be in her room, but the door had to remain ajar. There was no explicit rule about it. There never had been. It had simply always been that way. One of those customs that take root without anyone declaring them, and that later prove almost impossible to pinpoint for what they are. On Sundays, they went together to the 11 o'clock Mass at the Cathedral Basilica of Manizales. Hernando greeted acquaintances with the ease of someone accustomed to being recognized. Daniela walked beside him with an expression that was hard to read. It could be calmness, or it could be something she had learned to make herself look like. No one in the neighborhood spoke ill of Hernando Restrepo. He was too upright for that, too helpful, too present in moments when the community needed someone who knew how to draft a document or explain a procedure without charging a fee. But there was something those who knew him closely noticed and preferred not to mention: the way he spoke of Daniela when she wasn't present. Not as a father speaks of a daughter, with a different kind of possessiveness, more intense, as if every achievement of hers were a direct extension of his own identity, and every connection she formed with the outside world were a variable that needed to be managed. One afternoon, at the corner drugstore, someone asked him, with the friendly intent of someone making small talk, if Daniela already had a boyfriend. Hernando paid for the pills he'd ordered, calmly collected his change, and replied without raising his voice. Daniela doesn't need to look for anything outside. Everything a woman needs, I give her. The pharmacist changed the subject. He didn't ask again. That night, Daniela served dinner at the dining room table, while Hernando smoothed out the tablecloth with that precision of his that left no wrinkles. When she sat down, he looked at her from the head of the table with a calm that held too many things inside and said, as if commenting on the weather, "You're the only thing that matters to me in this world, sweetheart. The only thing that's truly mine." Daniela didn't respond. She lowered her eyes to her plate. She had been hearing variations of that phrase for years. She had learned not to react, just as she had learned not to talk about her home with her college classmates, to construct a condensed and presentable version of her life for the outside world. A seamless version, without details, that would require too much explanation. What Daniela didn't know was that very semester, a man named Camilo Andrade Ospina had begun teaching constitutional law at her college, and that some things, once they start moving, cannot be stopped. Camilo Andrade Ospina was 38 years old and had a habit of arriving to class with a folder full of his own underlines. He was a constitutional lawyer, a graduate of the National University's Bogotá campus, and had accepted the teaching position in Manizales after ending a long relationship that left him with few possessions, many books, and an urgent need to move to a new city. He wasn't a man who filled the air with noise. He spoke with precision, listened with genuine attention, and possessed that rare quality of treating his students as interlocutors rather than as passive recipients. Daniela noticed this from the second week of classes, not for romantic reasons, but for a more basic one. He was the only professor who paused before responding. When she proposed an interpretation of the right to privacy in a constitutional court ruling, Camilo didn't interrupt her or correct her immediately. He tilted his head slightly and said, "Elaborate on that idea. It has something to it." That pause, so different from anything she had ever known, stirred something within her. A slow, almost imperceptible movement, like soil that hadn't been touched in a long time. Their conversations began after class, always on academic topics. Then they spilled into the hallways, to legal cases that neither of them had asked for as a pretext, but that served as one. One Thursday in August, Camilo asked her if she wanted to grab a coffee to continue the discussion on a writ of protection ruling. Daniela glanced at her watch before answering. He noticed, but didn't mention it. She agreed. They spent 40 minutes in a small cafe 4 blocks from the university. Daniela arrived, glancing around with a frequency that wasn't mere caution. When she stood up to leave, he asked if they could do it again. She hesitated for a moment too long to be just shyness, and said yes. What Camilo still didn't understand was the real cost of those minutes to her. Every meeting was a precision operation. How long she could stay, what explanation she would give, how to prevent the phone from ringing at the wrong moment. Hernando called without fail every 2 hours, not as a question, but as a check-in. The first day Daniela came home 20 minutes late, Hernando was sitting on the living room couch with his hands on his knees and the TV turned off. He didn't ask where she had been. He looked at her with that calm of his, calculated and sustained, and said, "I thought something had happened to you on the street." Dinner was in silence. Daniela knew she would have to learn to move more carefully. And she did, with the quiet skill developed by those who have lived a long time within a structure that never declares itself a cage, but functions exactly like one. Her meetings with Camilo continued. They became more frequent, longer, more honest. One October afternoon, walking along the Paseo del Rio, he took her hand. She didn't pull it away. In that simple gesture, almost ordinary for anyone else, Daniela felt something she didn't know she was missing. The sensation that someone was choosing her unconditionally. 2 months later, Camilo told her he loved her. Daniela didn't respond right away. She looked at the stones on the sidewalk. She breathed slowly. Then she said in a low voice, "Me too. But there are things you need to know about my home." Camilo listened for over an hour. When she finished, he didn't promise that everything would be okay. He just said, "Do you want to get out of there?" Daniela looked him in the eyes for the first time during the entire conversation. "Yes," she replied, "but I don't know if he'll let me." Camilo went to the house in Los Cedros one Saturday afternoon. He dressed carefully, a burgundy long-sleeved shirt, dark trousers, clean shoes. He carried a box of sweets from La Galleria market, the kind of gesture that in Manizales conveys respect before words do. He introduced himself by his full name, mentioning his position at the university, his hometown of Pereira, and his family. He spoke calmly and with his head held high. Hernando listened to him standing in the doorway, without inviting him in for the first few minutes. He studied him with the same expression a man accustomed to reading documents uses to evaluate a clause that raises doubts. Finally, he stepped aside and gestured toward the living room with a brief nod. Daniela wasn't there. Hernando had asked her to go up to her room before Camilo arrived. The conversation lasted half an hour. Camilo spoke of his intentions, his professional stability, his respect for Daniela. Hernando listened, asked questions with a courtesy that felt more uncomfortable than outright rudeness, and in the end, said he would think it over. That important decisions weren't made in a hurry. Camilo left without having seen Daniela even for a moment. Over the following weeks, Hernando subjected Camilo to a series of meetings that looked like conversations, but functioned as interrogations. He summoned him to the house on Saturdays, always with Daniela present but rarely participating, as if she were a decorative element in a negotiation in which she had no voice. He asked about finances, about the family in Pereira, about religious beliefs, about 5-year plans. He took mental notes of every answer with a precision that was unsettling. Camilo held on. He did so because Daniela sent him messages late at night, when Hernando was asleep, with short phrases that said more by what they omitted than by what they stated. "Thank you for not giving up. This week was tough. I dream of having a key that's just mine." One Sunday in November, after Mass, what Daniela had always feared happened. Hernando found her replying to a message from Camilo in the kitchen. He didn't yell. He never yelled. He closed the door slowly, leaned against the counter, and looked at her for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then he spoke. He told her that Camilo was a stranger who didn't really know her, that no man could understand her the way he did, because no man had been there from the beginning, from when she was a little girl who cried at night, calling for a mother who could no longer answer, that he had given up his own life so that she would lack nothing, that this wasn't something that could be paid for with a box of candy and a long-sleeved shirt. Daniela tried to speak. He raised a hand, not brusquely, but with the authority of someone unaccustomed to being interrupted. Then he said the words. He said it with a gentleness that made it heavier than any scream. "You were born to be mine alone, Daniela. That is not something you can change, nor is it something that man can understand." The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Daniela felt something that wasn't exactly fear, though it resembled it. It was the sudden realization of something that had always been there, that she had learned to skirt around without naming it, and that in that moment was laid bare with a clarity that left no room for interpretation. That night she didn't text Camilo. The next day, when they saw each other before class in the college hallway, he noticed something different in the way she walked, in the way her eyes took a moment longer than usual to meet his. He asked if she was okay. She replied that she was, with the quickness of someone who has given that answer too many times without telling the truth. Then, in a very low voice, she added, "We need to be more careful, much more." Camilo nodded. But that night, alone in his apartment in the Centro neighborhood, he wrote a message to his older sister in Pereira. He told her what Daniela had repeated to him about the conversation with Hernando, word for word. It took his sister several minutes to reply. When she did, she wrote a single question. Does she have anyone else to lean on? Camilo stared at the screen for a moment. Then he wrote, I think so far she only has me. Camilo's sister was named Patricia Andrade Ospina and had been working as a social worker in Pereira for 12 years. When her brother described the situation in more detail during a call that lasted nearly 2 hours, Patricia listened without interrupting. At the end, she said something Camilo hadn't expected. What you're describing isn't an overprotective family. It has a technical name, and that name changes everything we need to do from now on. She recommended that Daniela speak with a psychologist before making any practical decisions. That she document everything, that she not act hastily. That the most common mistake in these situations was underestimating how far someone who had spent decades building that level of control was capable of going. Camilo relayed everything to Daniela one Wednesday afternoon, sitting in a small park in the Chipre neighborhood with the city spread out below and the cold wind blowing down from the hills at that time of year. Daniela listened with her hands clasped on her knees. Then she said, without raising her voice, I know it has a name. I always knew. It's just that naming it means you can no longer pretend it doesn't exist. She agreed to speak with the psychologist Patricia recommended, a specialist in domestic violence who saw patients in a discreet office in downtown Manizales. The appointments were on Tuesdays at noon, during the only time slot when Daniela had an hour free without Hernando expecting her to return immediately. She told him it was a mandatory academic tutoring session. He didn't ask any further questions, but that week the calls increased to 3 per hour. It was the psychologist who suggested, during the 3rd session, that she carefully examine the physical spaces of the house, not as a search, but as an exercise in recognition, to understand the environment in which she had lived through different eyes. Daniela didn't fully understand the instruction at that moment. She understood it 3 days later, on a Tuesday when Hernando went out to run a notary errand and took longer than expected. Daniela entered the study. It was a room that Hernando usually kept locked, but that day he had left it unlocked, probably because he was in a hurry. Shelves with legal volumes, folders organized by year, an old printer. Nothing out of the ordinary on the surface. But in the bottom drawer of the desk, behind a folder of tax documents, she found a wooden box with a metal clasp that she had never seen before. It wasn't locked. Inside were 3 hardcover notebooks, letter-sized, with hand-numbered covers. The first one had D from the beginning written in the upper corner. She opened the first one with a slowness that wasn't caution, but something akin to the premonition of someone who knows that what they are about to see cannot be undone. The first pages were dated 19 years ago, when Daniela was 5 and Lucinda had just died. The handwriting was upright and neat, the same script Hernando used to draft public deeds, but the content had nothing of a notary's about it. It was a meticulous record of Daniela's life, written in the first-person plural. Today we went to the park, and she laughed in a way that reminded me of her mother, but better. Today she turned 8. I bought her the dress she wanted, and we danced alone in the living room. Today I did her hair because she said she liked how I did it better. The constant use of we did not describe a family. It described something for which Daniela, at that moment, could not find an immediate word, but which gave her a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. The second notebook began when she was 14. The tone changed gradually, but steadily. There were entries describing jealousy towards schoolmates, others detailing what clothes she had worn that day and whether she thought the clothes were appropriate. One entry, dated when Daniela was 17, read, "I explained to her that men on the outside can't understand her the way I do. I think she understood." She was calmer today. The third notebook was the most recent. The last pages covered the previous weeks. There was an entire section dedicated to Camilo, written with a rage that the neatness of the handwriting couldn't quite contain. "That man doesn't know who she is. He doesn't know what I've given. Daniela is the only thing that belongs to me in this world, and I won't let anyone come and destroy what I've built." The last entry was dated 4 days earlier. It read, "If she thinks she can leave, she still doesn't understand who she's talking to." Daniela closed the notebook. She put it back in the box. She closed the drawer. She left the study and closed the door with the same care with which she had opened it. She sat on the edge of her bed and remained motionless for several minutes. Then she picked up her phone and sent Camilo a 3-word message. "I found something serious." That night, she didn't eat dinner. She told Hernando she had a headache. He brought her a cup of chamomile tea to her room, set it on the nightstand with a gentleness that under other circumstances would have seemed tender, and tucked the blanket around her with a familiarity that Daniela now could no longer interpret any other way. When he closed the door, she lay staring at the ceiling with her eyes open. For the first time in her life, fear had a concrete form, and facing it was, at the same time, the only way to start moving forward. Patricia arrived in Manizales on a Thursday morning on the first bus from Pereira. She brought a small suitcase and a folder with contacts, a lawyer specializing in domestic violence, the numbers for the municipal family police station, and the protocol she had used in similar cases during her years as a social worker. She didn't arrive as a sister-in-law. She arrived as a professional. The three of them met at Camilo's apartment. Daniela brought the notebook she had photographed with her phone, image by image, during the early hours of the previous morning while Hernando slept. Patricia reviewed them in silence for 20 minutes. When she looked up, her expression wasn't one of surprise. It was that of someone who recognizes a pattern she's seen before and knows exactly what it means. "This is enough evidence for a formal complaint," she said, "and possibly for an immediate protective order." The lawyer Patricia contacted was named Susana Mejia Rios, and she had 15 years of experience litigating cases of psychological violence and abuse in the Coffee region. When Daniela described the situation to her and showed her the photographs of the notebooks, Susana asked 3 specific questions: whether there were witnesses to controlling behavior, whether there were call records, and whether Daniela was willing to testify before a judge. Daniela answered yes to all 3. The complaint was filed with the Office of the Attorney General, Manizales branch, on a Monday morning. Daniela signed the statement with a firmer hand than she had expected. The case was assigned to the First Family Court of the Manizales Circuit, presided over by Judge Rodrigo Peñalosa Vargas, a magistrate with 22 years of experience in family law and child protection, recognized in the local legal community for his methodical nature and his ability to remain unflappable in any situation. The preliminary hearing took place 18 days after the complaint was filed, in a small courtroom at the Manizales courthouse, overlooking Bolivar Square. Hernando Restrepo arrived accompanied by his own lawyer, an older man with whom he had worked on notarial matters for years. He entered with his usual posture, chin raised, the expression of someone who does not understand why he is being subjected to a proceeding he considers a misunderstanding. Susana Mejia presented the evidence in chronological order. First, The call logs, which showed an average of 9 calls per day to Daniela's phone over the past 3 years. Then, the testimonies of 2 college classmates who stated they had seen Hernando waiting for Daniela in the parking lot on multiple occasions, and had witnessed how her demeanor changed when she saw him arrive. Then the statement from the psychologist who had treated Daniela, who described with precise clinical terminology the pattern of coercive control documented during the sessions. And finally, the photographs of the notebooks. Susanna projected them onto the screen in the courtroom page by page, reading aloud the most relevant excerpts with the same calmness one uses when reading a legal document. Judge Peñalosa Vargas took notes with his pen in the hearing notebook. When Susanna reached the section dedicated to Daniela's teenage years, the judge stopped writing. When she reached the last entry, the one that read, "Daniela is the only thing that belongs to me in this world," Judge Peñalosa set his pen down on the table and remained silent for several seconds. He took off his glasses, cleaned them with a gesture that was not a habit, but a necessity of the moment, and put them back on. He looked at Hernando. Hernando held his gaze with his usual composure for exactly 3 seconds. Then he looked away toward the window. The judge called a 15-minute recess. When he returned, his expression was that of someone who has seen many things in 22 years and has just seen something for which none of those years had fully prepared him. He granted the immediate protective order. He ordered Hernando Restrepo Cardona to refrain from all direct or indirect contact with Daniela, to vacate the family home within 72 hours, and to undergo a mandatory psychiatric evaluation as a condition of the proceedings. When the clerk read the ruling aloud, Hernando remained motionless. His lawyer whispered something in his ear. He did not respond. Daniela was sitting on the other side of the room. She didn't cry. Her hands were clasped on the table, and her eyes fixed on a single spot on the wall, with the expression of someone who had just heard something she had been waiting for a long time, without knowing exactly what she was waiting for. Outside, in the hallway of the Palace of Justice, Camilo was waiting for her, standing next to Patricia. When Daniela came out, none of the 3 said anything for a moment. Then Patricia placed a hand on her shoulder, and that was enough. Hernando Restrepo Cardona left the house in Los Cedros on Wednesday afternoon, 71 hours after the court ruling. He did so with 2 suitcases and a cardboard box. A neighbor who was going out to buy the newspaper saw him load the car in silence, without rushing, with that composure of his that never wavered in the face of anything. He didn't look to the sides. He didn't say hello. He started the Renault Logan and turned the corner onto the main avenue without stopping. The house stood empty for 3 days. Daniela didn't return immediately. She stayed at a college friend's apartment, while Susana Mejia coordinated the details of the process with the family court. Patricia stayed in Manizales that entire week, not because it was strictly necessary, but because she had learned in 12 years of social work that the first few days after a breakup like this are the most fragile. Not because of what the other person might do, but because of what begins to stir within the one who has finally left. Daniela returned to the house in Los Cedros one Saturday morning, accompanied by Camilo and Patricia. She entered slowly. The interior garden held the begonias that Hernando had watered for 19 years with the devotion of someone who cares for what he considers his own. They were still in bloom, oblivious to everything. She walked through the rooms with a calmness that was not indifference but concentration. She stopped in the study. The bottom drawer of the desk was empty. Hernando had taken the notebooks. That didn't change anything from a legal standpoint. The photographs were already part of the case file. But Daniela stood staring at the open drawer for a moment with an expression that Camilo couldn't quite decipher. Then she gently closed the drawer and said in a low voice, almost to herself, "It doesn't matter anymore. The person who needed to read them has already read them." No, the case dragged on for 4 more months. The psychiatric evaluation ordered by Judge Peñalosa diagnosed Hernando Restrepo with a pathological attachment disorder featuring narcissistic personality traits and obsessive fixation, developed and sustained over decades without intervention. The report noted that the subject did not recognize his behaviors as problematic and consistently interpreted them as legitimate expressions of love and protection. When that report was read at the second hearing, Judge Peñalosa took off his glasses again. It was a gesture that those who worked in that courtroom had learned to recognize. He did it only when something affected him more deeply than his position allowed him to show openly. The prosecutor in charge sought charges of domestic psychological violence and the arbitrary exercise of emotional custody, offenses covered under Law 1257 of 2008 on non-violence against women. The defense argued that there was no documented physical violence and that the relationship between father and daughter, though intense, fell within the scope of culturally understandable family dynamics. Judge Peñalosa dismissed that argument in 3 paragraphs that his colleagues would later cite in other cases. The third stated, "The absence of physical violence does not constitute the absence of violence. Confinement constructed through words, systematic surveillance, and the sustained denial of a person's autonomous identity is a form of deprivation of liberty that the Colombian legal system recognizes and punishes, regardless of the emotional bonds the aggressor invokes as justification." Hernando was sentenced to 4 years of house arrest, disqualification from holding notarial office for the same period, and mandatory supervised psychological treatment. The sentence was considered insufficient by some sectors and excessive by others. The debate raged for weeks on local radio programs, in parents' WhatsApp groups, and in dinner table conversations that made people uncomfortable because they forced them to confront issues many would rather avoid. Doña Carmenza, the neighbor across the street, who had spent years watching Daniela come and go with that hard-to-read expression, testified before the family court that on one occasion she had heard Hernando introduce Daniela to a visitor using the word "my partner," and that at the time she thought she had misunderstood, that she erased it from her memory because she didn't know where to place it. Her statement was not the only one of its kind. 3 more neighbors, 2 colleagues from the notary's office, and a distant relative who visited the house on special occasions gave similar testimonies. Moments they had perceived as strange, phrases that didn't fit, gestures they preferred not to name. No one had said anything for years, not out of active complicity, but because of something harder to process, because Hernando Restrepo was a respectable man, and the respect he commanded acted as an invisible wall around what was happening inside. Daniela finished her law degree in December. She defended her thesis on procedural guarantees in cases of domestic violence with a grade of 5 out of 5. None of her professors knew until months later that some of the material she cited in the theoretical framework corresponded indirectly to her own case file. She moved into a small apartment in the Milan neighborhood, with windows overlooking a park. She had her own key. 2 keys. Actually, the one for the front door and the one for the mailbox. She carried them in her pants pocket, and sometimes, without anyone noticing, she would brush them with her fingers as she walked. It was a small gesture, but it was entirely her own. Months later, from Manizales, she sent a handwritten letter to the psychologist who had treated her during the process. The last line read, "For a long time, I believed that was what love looked like. Now I know that love doesn't need a key to keep you inside." The file was archived at the First Family Court of the Manizales Circuit, under a number that revealed nothing about its contents. The notebooks Hernando took were never recovered, but the photographs remain in the system. 147 digitized pages that a man wrote, convinced he was documenting devotion, and which, in reality, documented the detailed blueprint of a prison built around a person from the moment that person learned to walk. The begonias in the garden at Los Cedros continued to bloom. No one watered them. They remained the same.